For decades, she stayed quiet. No gossip, no call-outs, no tell-all interviews. Linda Ronstadt was the rare kind of artist who let her voice, not her headlines, do the talking. But now, at 78, that silence has finally broken. In a rare moment of reflection and honesty, Ronstadt is revealing the 7 musicians who hurt her, betrayed her, or scarred her so deeply. She never truly forgave them. These aren't petty feuds. They're not tabloid drama. They're the untold stories of broken friendships, backstage betrayals, and emotional cuts that ran too deep to ignore. And some of these names, they'll shock you. Long before he was the frontman of one of the biggest rock bands in American history, Don Henley was just a drummer in Linda Ronstadt's backing band. It was the early 1970s. Linda was on the rise, a breakout voice with range, control, and an authenticity the industry couldn't ignore. And like many great artists, she surrounded herself with young, hungry musicians who were just getting started. Don Henley was one of them. So was Glenn Frey. They weren't stars yet. They were kids with talent and dreams, playing behind a woman who was opening every door for them. Linda didn't just give them a job, she gave them a platform. She took them on tour, let them share the spotlight, encouraged their writing, and treated them as equals. When they expressed a desire to form their own band, she supported them. That band would become the Eagles. And for a while, it seemed like there was real mutual respect. Linda continued to speak kindly of their work. She admired their sound. She believed in their success. But success changed Don Henley. After the Eagles broke through with hits like Take It Easy and Desperado, Henley's demeanor reportedly shifted, from grateful to aloof, then to arrogant. It wasn't just confidence, it was distance. The man who once stood behind Linda on stage barely acknowledged her in public. The moment that ended it for her came in 1975. Backstage at the Universal Amphitheater, Henley, riding high off the Eagles' growing fame, dismissed her music as safe and said she should stick to covers and love songs. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't playful. It was condescending. He said it loud enough for others to hear. No apology, no self-awareness. Linda didn't argue. She didn't create a scene. She simply cut ties. His backstage pass was revoked. The tour ended. The friendship faded into silence. Years later, when asked about her relationship with the Eagles, Linda was always careful with her words. But in private, according to those close to her, she felt deeply betrayed. Not because Don Henley became a star, but because he climbed the ladder she helped build, then acted like he'd built it himself. She once said in a closed interview, "Don was talented, no doubt, but he forgot who reached down and gave him a hand when no one else would." To Linda, the betrayal wasn't just personal. It was symbolic of a pattern she'd seen too many times. A woman lifting others up, only to be stepped over the minute power shifted. That wasn't just painful. It was familiar. It was the summer of 1968. Los Angeles at its loudest. The Sunset Strip pulsed with neon heat. Music spilled from every club. Rock icons walked the street like they owned the world. And inside a cramped, dimly lit after-party not far from the Whiskey A Go-Go, 2 legends crossed paths. Linda Ronstadt wasn't a household name yet, not in the mainstream, but inside industry circles, she was already earning a reputation, not just for her crystal-clear voice, but for the control she demanded over her own path. Even at that early stage, Linda wasn't the kind of woman you pushed around. Jim Morrison, on the other hand, didn't care about boundaries. He was already famous, already dangerous. The Doors had exploded. Their sound was revolutionary, dark, poetic, chaotic. And so was he, a beautiful wreck of a man. At that party, Morrison was drunk. Not surprising, shirt half unbuttoned, a drink in each hand, slurring quotes from Rumbo and laughing at his own jokes. And then he saw her. Linda was standing near the corner, speaking to another musician, holding a club soda. Calm, collected, a total contrast to the swirling madness around her. Morrison cut across the room like he was on stage, loud, unfiltered. Before she could react, he pulled her toward him. Not violently, but with a kind of sloppy confidence that assumed the world would say yes. And then he tried to kiss her. On the lips. In front of everyone. Linda pulled away instantly. Her elbow came up instinctively, blocking him. He stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, laughing like it was a game. The room didn't cheer. It paused. Linda didn't scream. She didn't slap him. But she didn't stay either. She quietly left the party and never spoke to him again. For years, she never mentioned the moment publicly. Why would she? He was a legend, and she, still rising. But to her, that moment became symbolic of something bigger. The casual entitlement of men in power, the assumption that fame was a passport to other people's bodies, that women, especially women in music, were expected to go along or be labeled difficult. In a private interview decades later, she reflected on that night saying, "He wasn't charming, he wasn't mysterious, he was a sad man drowning in the idea of himself." What made the betrayal sting wasn't just the act, it was how Morrison talked about it afterward. A few months later, on a radio interview, he laughed about the party and called her sweet but spineless, mocking her refusal like it was a performance flaw. Linda never responded publicly, but she never forgot either. She would later tell close friends that Jim Morrison represented everything she was fighting to rise above in the industry: the chaos, the ego, the entitlement disguised as artistry. He wasn't just a moment she avoided, he became a warning. In the mid-1970s, few artists were as respected or as fiercely independent as Neil Young. He stood for something: protest music, artistic freedom, emotional grit. When he played, people listened not just to the melody, but to the message. Linda Ronstadt admired that. For years, she'd praised Young's songwriting, called it raw, honest, haunted in all the right ways. In interviews, she listed him among her influences, not just musically, but politically. So when the opportunity came in 1976 to share the stage with him at a benefit concert for farm workers, a cause both artists deeply believed in, she said yes without hesitation. What happened next changed everything. From the moment rehearsals began, something was off. According to people close to the event, Neil Young arrived late, gruff, distracted. He barely acknowledged the other artists. When Linda approached him to talk about the set list, he reportedly shrugged and said, "Just sing what you're comfortable with, or don't." It wasn't rude, it was dismissive. Linda, always a professional, tried again, this time offering to collaborate on a harmony during one of his protest anthems. He declined. "I don't do duets," he said, then walked away. Still, she stayed focused. She planned to perform 2 of her own songs, both carrying strong political themes, both aimed at uplifting the voices of workers and marginalized communities. But hours before the concert, she was told her slot had been cut from 2 songs to 1. And the reason? Neil Young. Apparently, he'd insisted on rearranging the flow of the night, giving himself additional time for a new unreleased song and trimming down supporting performances to avoid what he called diluting the focus. Linda was stunned. It wasn't about ego. It was about principle. They were there to support the cause, not showcase one artist over the others. This wasn't a tour. This was solidarity. She performed anyway. One song sharp and beautiful, but walked off stage with tears in her eyes. Later, when asked about the concert by Rolling Stone, Neil said Linda had a great voice, but added that she wasn't built for protest, implying that her pop background made her activism feel shallow. That line, it stayed with her for years. It wasn't just a slight, it was a rejection of her identity, of her sincerity, a public undermining from someone she once considered an ally. To Linda, protest wasn't a genre. It was lived experience. Her Mexican-American heritage, her upbringing in a politically aware family, her consistent activism, it was real. It wasn't a gimmick. And for Neil Young, a man she admired, to reduce her efforts to marketing, it didn't just bruise her, it cut her trust. She never shared a stage with him again, never collaborated, never commented publicly, but friends say it marked a shift in her inner circle. She no longer assumed shared values meant shared respect. Sometimes the people who sing about truth don't live it. In 1974, Ronstadt and Zappa agreed to collaborate. It sounded revolutionary, but once inside the studio, the promise collapsed. Zappa mocked her ideas, calling her sound too sanitized, said she was trying to turn raw art into a jingle. Then, during rehearsal, he stopped the band and sneered, "This is what happens when you hand real music to a pop singer." Linda didn't fight. She packed up and left. Behind the scenes, she later said Zappa was brilliant, but brutal. A mind she respected, but a man she could never trust again. That moment stuck with her. In the late 1960s and early 70s, Laurel Canyon wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a movement, a hidden hillside above Los Angeles where the biggest names in rock and folk gathered like family. You'd walk out to grab coffee and pass Joni Mitchell strumming on her porch. You'd head to a studio jam and find David Crosby, Graham Nash, and Stephen Stills laying down vocals in someone's living room. It was free, collaborative, messy, and for Linda Ronstadt, it felt like home. And in that home, one of her closest artistic companions was David Crosby. He wasn't just a bandmate of her friends, he was part of her musical inner circle. They shared producers, stages, late-night jams, and a passion for crafting harmonies that felt effortless and alive. In those early years, Crosby was warm, generous, always championing the younger talents around him. He respected Linda's voice, her work ethic, her refusal to be boxed in. They worked on harmonies together, talked about politics, spoke the same musical language, built on emotion over perfection. But something changed. As Crosby's career exploded with Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, so did his ego, and so did the distance between him and the people who once called him a brother. In 1978, the two found themselves back in the studio on a collaboration session, a quiet harmony line Linda had been asked to contribute to a folk rock track Crosby was producing. The session should have been easy, routine, nostalgic even. Instead, it was strained from the first minute. When Linda arrived, Crosby barely looked up from the control booth. He gave no direction, no greeting. She went into the booth, nailed the vocal in 2 takes, and waited for feedback. What she got was a sigh and a passive-aggressive comment. She used to try harder. Stunned, she stepped out to clarify. That's when Crosby said something that cut far deeper. He muttered to the engineer, "We're not in the age of authenticity anymore. Everything's manufactured." He never said her name. He didn't have to. Linda heard it. The engineer heard it. And she walked out of the session without another word. To most people, it may have seemed like a throwaway comment. But to Linda, someone who had built her career on resisting being manufactured, it was betrayal. They had come up together, shared rooms, friends, sounds. And now he was accusing her, publicly and indirectly, of being something she never was. Fake. What hurt wasn't the insult. It was who it came from. She'd stood by Crosby when he went through addiction. She defended him when he lashed out at press. She believed genuinely that their shared history meant something, but after that day, he never called, never apologized, never brought it up. And Linda? She quietly pulled the plug on the friendship. People close to her say she began avoiding sessions that involved Crosby. She removed his music from her personal rehearsal playlists, and if anyone brought up his name in conversation, she'd nod politely, then change the subject. He didn't become an enemy. He just disappeared. And in many ways, that was more painful. In her later years, Linda would reflect on the relationships that shaped her and the ones that shattered. Crosby was one of the few who did both. And for all his talent, all his legacy, she never forgave how easily he ghosted a friendship that had once meant the world. He didn't leave a fight behind. He left a silence. In 1979, at a major festival in Cleveland, Linda was riding a wave of chart-topping success. Costello, the rising punk disruptor with something to prove. In front of reporters, he mocked her set as background music for brunch. Later that night, when she confronted him backstage, he doubled down. Cold, arrogant, unapologetic. To Linda, Costello wasn't just rude. He represented a new generation of artists who mistook cruelty for cleverness. No heart, just venom. She never spoke to him again. It should have been magical. Paul Simon and Linda Ronstadt, 2 icons teaming up for a duet. But the moment they entered the studio, it unraveled. Simon nitpicked, rewrote lyrics, interrupted takes, gave condescending advice. Linda described the session as being scolded by a principal. She wasn't being guided. She was being controlled. The track was never released. She never went back. To her, Paul Simon wasn't a collaborator. He was a dictator in disguise. So, why now? Why at 78 is Linda Ronstadt finally sharing these stories? Because it was never about revenge. It was about surviving in an industry built to ignore women like her, about honoring what she endured, what she carried, and what she let go, silently, so the music could speak louder. These weren't just feuds. They were milestones, markers of pain, power, and the price of staying graceful in the face of disrespect. Linda Ronstadt never needed to scream to be heard. But now that she's speaking, it's not just history, it's a reckoning. Because behind every harmony, there's a silence that deserves to be broken. This is Behind the Lightstick. Subscribe for more untold stories, hidden truths, and the voices that dared to speak when it mattered most.